The ground remembered everything. Not the paintings, not the mythology, not the century and a half of romantic reconstruction that turned a military catastrophe into a national legend and a defeated general into a martyred hero. The ground itself, the specific, documented, forensically examined soil of a Montana ridgeline where 210 men were destroyed in less than an hour on June 25, 1876, held the physical record of what actually happened that afternoon. And for 107 years, it held that record in silence. Then a grass fire changed everything. August 19, 1983. The fire moved across 900 acres of the Little Bighorn battlefield with the indiscriminate efficiency of a force that does not distinguish between sacred ground and dry grass. When it was finished, the vegetation cover that had concealed the battlefield surface for a century was gone. The soil was exposed. And archaeologist Douglas Scott recognized immediately what the fire had made possible. He began a systematic survey in 1984 that he would continue for the next 27 years. He walked every inch of that field. He organized teams of trained volunteers into systematic survey lines, their own version of a skirmish line moving across the ground in methodical passes with metal detectors. He used total station transits, then electronic distance meters, then global positioning systems to record the precise location of every artifact before it left the soil. 3,000 acres surveyed out of the 9,000 considered the field of battle. Approximately 5,000 artifacts recovered. The precision of that recording was not procedural caution. It was the only thing standing between the artifacts and silence. To understand what the ground was about to reveal, a man needs to understand what had brought 210 soldiers to that particular ridgeline in the first place. The summer campaign of 1876 was a 3-column operation designed with the strategic confidence of men who had not yet encountered what was waiting for them in the valley of the Little Bighorn. General George Crook would move north from Fort Fetterman with approximately 950 men. Colonel John Gibbon would march from Fort Ellis in Montana. General Alfred Terry would advance from Fort Abraham Lincoln with the 7th Cavalry. The 3 columns would converge, deny the non-reservation Lakota and Cheyenne bands any avenue of escape, and force them back onto their designated territories. The plan began to fail on June 17th. Crook's column encountered a Lakota and Cheyenne force under Crazy Horse at the Rosebud River. The engagement lasted most of a day. Crook held the ground at its conclusion and filed a report describing a victory. Then he withdrew to Goose Creek, a withdrawal that removed his 950 men from the campaign at the precise moment the campaign was approaching its decisive phase. He did not communicate this withdrawal to Terry or Gibbon. The southern wall of the encirclement had ceased to exist. The 2 remaining columns had no idea. On June 22nd, Terry sent the 7th Cavalry south along the Rosebud under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. On the morning of June 25th, Custer's Crow scouts observed from a position called the Crow's Nest what they described as a massive encampment in the valley of the Little Bighorn. Perhaps 5,000 people, a horse herd of similar or greater size, smoke from multiple cook fires stretching for 3/4 of a mile along the valley floor. Custer examined the view through his binoculars. He could not distinguish what his scouts were describing. He pressed forward regardless. He divided his command into 3 elements. Captain Frederick Benteen took several companies south to ensure no warriors were positioned behind the column. Major Marcus Reno took 3 companies directly into the valley with orders to attack the village's southern end, with Custer's explicit promise of support from the rear. What Custer did not tell Reno was that the support he intended was not coming from behind. It was coming from across the river, from the high bluffs on the eastern bank. Moving north to strike the village at its center, Reno entered the valley with approximately 190 men. 900 mounted warriors came out of the camp circles to meet him. They flanked his position before his attack had achieved any penetration of the village. At close range, Reno's most experienced scout, Bloody Knife, was shot through the head. The impact was proximate, immediate, and viscerally catastrophic. It contributed to a command paralysis that converted a tactical withdrawal into a disordered retreat across the river and up the bluffs. Reno's command was neutralized as a fighting force for the duration of what followed. What followed was the destruction of Custer's command, 210 men, scattered across a half-mile of ridgeline in 3 separate groups. Surrounded by a force whose numbers, the archaeology would later establish, included somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors, the men who had pinned Reno down now flowing north toward Custer's position, with the momentum of a force that had already won one engagement that afternoon and knew it. The best available estimate of the entire engagement's duration is between 45 minutes and slightly over an hour. The marble markers standing on the Little Bighorn battlefield today were placed where the soldiers' bodies were found, the only battlefield in the world where the markers indicate the actual position of the fallen, rather than the location of a subsequent mass grave. 252 markers for 210 dead. The discrepancy was one of the analytical problems the project inherited. What the artifact distribution confirmed was that the markers were, in most cases, reasonably accurate indicators of where men had died. The white dots on the project's distribution maps clustered with the artifact deposits and patterns whose specific geography told a story no written account had managed with comparable precision. The warriors had used the terrain, the viewshed analysis, the systematic mapping of what could and could not be seen from the high ground of Last Stand Hill, produced one of the project's most significant findings. From the position where Custer's body was found, alongside roughly 40 others, including his brother Tom, his brother Boston, his nephew Audie Reed, and his brother-in-law Calhoun, 5 members of the Custer family dead on that field in that single afternoon, the analysis identified multiple depressions in the surrounding terrain that the high ground defenders could not observe, ravines, coulees, the specific folds of the Montana landscape that a force defending the ridge from above could not cover with fire. The Indian cartridge cases were concentrated in those invisible places. The warriors moved through the ground the soldiers could not see. They closed the distance from positions the defenders could not reach. They delivered fire from angles that the tactical training of the United States Army, take the high ground, hold the high ground, had not prepared the men on that ridge to address. The soldiers did what they had been trained to do. Their training had been built for a different fight. The weapons analysis produced numbers that the written record had suggested, but never established with forensic precision. The United States Army arrived at the Little Bighorn with 2 weapons, the Colt single-action Army revolver and the Springfield Model 1873 trapdoor carbine. A small number of officers carried personal arms. Custer carried a Remington rolling block sporting rifle chambered for the .45-70 cartridge. The Army's armament was standardized, documented, and limited to those categories. The warriors opposing them carried 47 different types of firearms, 47 cartridge arms and muzzle loaders, surplus Civil War carbines and pistols distributed as treaty annuities, commercially purchased Winchesters and Henrys that had moved into Lakota and Cheyenne, hands through the same trading networks that moved everything else of value across the frontier. The minimum number of individual weapons represented by the recovered cartridge cases exceeded 900, the overwhelming majority of them in Lakota and Cheyenne hands. 900 weapons against the Army's 2 types. The mathematics of that disparity is not a footnote to the battle. It is the battle. The cartridge case analysis went deeper than counting. The tool mark signatures preserved on cartridge cases, the firing pin impressions, the extractor marks, the ejector marks, are as specific to an individual weapon as a fingerprint to an individual person. They identified cases fired in the same weapon across different positions on the battlefield. The results produced something that no eyewitness account and no written record could have produced independently. Movement maps, a sequence of 44 caliber rimfire cases bearing the consistent tool mark signature of a single Henry or Winchester Model 1866, was distributed across nearly a mile of battlefield. The positions of those cases formed a trail through the soil documenting the movement of one warrior carrying one weapon across the full length of the engagement. One person, one rifle, a mile of Montana ridgeline, the physical record of where that person had been and in what sequence. preserved in the ground for 107 years and recovered, one cartridge case at a time, by people walking systematic survey lines with metal detectors. The human remains recovered during the project's excavations carried their own testimony. The average soldier in the 7th Cavalry in 1876 was 22 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, 57% born in the United States or its territories. The remaining 43% predominantly Irish, German, and British. The immigrant labor pool of a republic still absorbing the men the frontier army drew from the docks and tenements of the eastern cities. Young men, hard lives. The skeletal record document poor dental health as the general condition. Vertebral Schmorl's nodes, the specific skeletal indicator of sustained heavy physical labor, appeared across the sample with a frequency that told a different story than the cavalry trooper of the romantic imagination. These were men whose bodies were wearing out in their early 20s from the accumulated physical demands of mounted service in country that asked more than it returned. The sharp force trauma requires a specific correction to the vocabulary the popular account has always applied to it. The marks on this individual and on comparable remains across the battlefield were not random desecration. They were deliberate marks of victory, specific cultural practices through which Lakota and Cheyenne warriors documented and commemorated what they had accomplished. The surrounding civilization received these practices as atrocity. The physical evidence receives them as the record of a cultural framework as internally coherent as the one that had sent those soldiers across that river. The ground does not choose sides. It simply holds what it is given. The most quietly devastating artifact the project recovered from 3,000 acres of surveyed ground was not a weapon. It was not a cartridge case or a piece of military equipment or a fragment of the Springfield carbines whose extraction failures had contributed to what happened on that ridge. It was a small brass ring, silver-plated, inexpensive, a wedding ring still encircling the finger bone of one of the 210. It had been placed on that finger by a woman who was not at the Little Bighorn. It had remained there through the engagement, through the burial, through the decades of undisturbed preservation in Montana soil. The project recovered it intact, a complete circle, a marriage documented in metal, waiting 107 years in the ground. The battle left widows and orphans on both sides of the river. That specific, material, irreducible fact is what the ring documents, not the mythology, not the strategic assessments, not the arguments about command decisions and tactical failures that the subsequent century and a half of debate has generated without resolution. A ring on a finger bone in the ground of a Montana battlefield, holding the weight of an ordinary human life inside something small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. The analytical conclusions of 27 years of systematic survey did not resolve every question the Little Bighorn has generated since July 6, 1876, the day the Eastern press received the news and spread it across the centennial summer like a stain that the celebrations could not contain. They were not designed to resolve every question. They were designed to answer the questions that physical evidence is capable of answering. And the answers those questions produced were these: 210 soldiers outgunned by a force carrying 47 different firearm types, represented by a minimum of 900 weapons. Warriors moving through terrain invisible from the high ground the soldiers had been trained to hold. A tactical doctrine built entirely around the reload window of a muzzle-loading era encountering a force whose armament had moved irreversibly beyond that era's limitations. A command scattered across a half-mile of ridgeline at odds of 7-1 in an engagement that lasted less than an hour. One warrior, one Henry rifle, a trail of cartridge cases stretching a mile through the Montana soil. One soldier, a gunshot wound still embedded in his radius, a foot still inside his boot. One ring, still on the finger that had worn it since the morning some woman had placed it there. The romantic version of the Little Bighorn gave America a hero on a hill, a last stand, a legend built from the specific materials that a nation celebrating its centennial needed to build it from. The archaeological version gave America something harder and something more honest: the ground, the evidence, the physical record of what actually happened on that ridgeline in the summer of 1876, preserved in the soil with the patient indifference of a witness that has no interest in the mythology and no capacity for the kind of forgetting that mythology requires. The ring was there for 107 years. It had not gone anywhere. Neither had the truth.